George and Diane, thanks so much for joining us tonight. If you could just introduce yourselves, please, to anyone that might be listening to this on podcast or video, please. George, you first.
Yeah, look, my name is George Panos. I was the chair of Spinal Cord Injuries Australia.
And I'm Dianne Lucas. I'm the CEO of SCIA, Spinal Cord Injuries Australia, and have been in the role for just over 7 years.
Beautiful. And tonight we're going to, in the next half hour or so, we'll talk about the merger between SCIA and the Royal Rehab Group. So let's just do a little bit of background first. Diane, you've been in the role 7 years. How did you get into this role, and what is your motivation for committing your life to social purpose?
So I used to work for St Vincent de Paul Society in New South Wales, and so I was having a moment there where I was saying, okay, what will I do? I had a bit of a career break, and then I decided that I was ready to come back to work, and then I was tapped on the shoulder to come along to the interview, and then I met the chair and the deputy chair at the time, and then I met the board. I was in obviously then also part of the interview process was to meet the whole board, and after that I was sold. It's an incredible organisation, does amazing things, and so connected to the lived experience and genuinely making a difference in people's lives. And it was very similar in its purpose and its approach to what I'd left in St Vincent de Paul Society.
Beautiful. And George, obviously, yours is a voluntary role as a director. From your perspective, what's one thing about SCIA that only people within the organisation truly understand or appreciate, or maybe a myth that those looking from outside might have?
Look, I think what people within the organisation really realise is really the personas of the people that we're trying to help. The people with Spinal Cords Injury Australia, the people with spinal cords injuries, we really understand what we need to do, and through peer support and the lived experience. For me, one of the things that's fantastic about SCIA is over half our board has lived experience. They're in wheelchairs, and
Okay.
I think with that, we then get this really beautiful perspective and matrix of, we may be able to look at it from a business perspective or an intellectual perspective, but suddenly we've actually got somebody from the lived experience.
Yeah.
I'm going to use a term is that, I didn't understand toilets until I actually joined Spinal Cords. I did not understand how important toilets are and the architecture of them and the need for them. And I think you realize all these little intricacies that as an outsider you have no idea and until you actually have somebody, either a loved one in a wheelchair or actually in the organization. And I think that's the thing that I think is really, really what people understand and what we actually try to tell people on the outside, because we actually understand we have the lived experience.
Yeah, very powerful. Beautiful. The relationship with Royal Rehab Group seems from the outside to have grown up pretty quickly, but it may not have done. So can you tell us a bit about when the idea of first joining with the Royal Rehab Group came up? Was there a specific moment or a challenge or a conversation? Maybe George, from a board perspective.
Look,
Yeah, when did
yeah,
the
look,
word merger first come up?
Look, I think I've been with SCARE for 7 years, and I think we probably have been looking to merge for six. And I think
Okay.
we've been talking with a lot of people in relation to the moving environment and understanding the critical mass issues, understanding the funding issues. So I think it's been a constant thought in the back of our mind, and I think this is probably the second time we spoke to Royal Rehab as well. I think we'd spoken to them a number of years ago, and I think during COVID. But I don't think anyone was actually ready to do a merger then, if I
Right.
recollect correctly. I think neither were we, but we actually had started that conversation. And then certainly we rekindled that conversation, certainly post-COVID, the last 12 months, where we really got into these discussions and then started to sort of draft a term sheet and start to actually on a regular basis have those discussions. So yeah, it wasn't, we didn't wake up one day and said, and within 3 weeks, it was a process through the board. So we had proper governance processes and lots of discussions. We went for the full audit in the full due diligence and the understandings. But certainly for me, one of the most important things was the term sheet and understanding what each party was looking for. So yeah, it's been a journey of a reasonable time frame.
And Dianne, you've been involved throughout that period. What changed from that first conversation, if even if it was a kind of low key or informal or hypothetical conversation, to 2025?
So the organisations had been working together for a long time, Alex. So our peer support service that are people living with a spinal cord injury actually offer peer support inside Royal Rehab, the hospital,
Okay.
in the specialist spinal rehabilitation unit. So we've had a long-term relationship. So Matt Mackay and myself had been, I've been in the role for just over 7. Matt's been in the role over 8 years. So we've engaged and interacted quite a lot over that time. So
Yeah.
and as George said, we'd had ongoing conversations at different times about the potential to be working more closely together. I think the key thing for us is that we'd been thinking about this for a long time, but it was all subject to the external environment. And what we found is that, we've been 6 years without a price increase under the NDIS.
Yeah.
As we all know, there's other changes that have occurred that have made running being a disability service provider becomes tough, and it's becoming tougher and tougher for a lot of us.
Yeah.
And so for us, it was that sort of natural attrition between Matt and myself where, Matt sort of did come out and say to me, he said, things are not getting easier. How about we start to have a conversation and make a bit more of a formal arrangement? And obviously, as George has said, the two boards had talked previously.
Yeah.
Our services align and complement each other. We'd work together, in an informal capacity for such a long time. It made a lot of sense to take that next step because we kind of already knew each other very well.
Okay. You've picked up on what I think is something that separates you from many other disability providers that I'm sure you've seen. Quite a few large and well-established organisations go to the wall this year. They've closed, gone to VA, or they've been swallowed up by others. And it looks from the outside like they didn't pick up on the early warning cues or the opportunity to have proactive and productive conversations like you guys did. What do you reckon was the secret sauce that allowed your board or your leadership to position themselves for a merger when other very capable and well qualified boards just haven't got to that place?
Uh,
George.
Yeah, I can answer that. Look, I think there's a couple of levels there. I think we had fantastic reporting. I think we knew our business really well. We had really, sort of sector reporting and business reporting. So we actually knew exactly where our money was coming from and where it was leaving. So we had, I'm not quite sure how many business units, but we had a lot of complexity. We ran the Neuromoves business, so we actually had profit and loss by location. So I think that was really the important thing. So we actually knew our numbers really well. So our reporting and our board packs were really important. Our analysis of the market was really important as well. And we realized, if we really wanted to exist, we needed there were some key drivers. And I think for us it was quite clear that the COVID overhang. We survived COVID and we've survived a number of rushes, but certainly the NDIS when they started not giving price increases, and then we had a couple of really large wage increases. Suddenly, our margins were being squeezed.
Yeah.
In some sense, we needed to start selling some assets. And some of our major partners, as I said, iCare could no longer support peer support. So we actually knew that we had a limited timeline to do certain things with our business. But then, how do we actually carry shocks? And because eventually you run out of your assets, you eventually sell the farm. Uh,
Yeah.
and so for us, it was that and knowledgeable saying, look, if we don't do something within the next 12, 18, 24 months or within a certain time frame, then we won't have a choice to do anything. And this is really why the board was constantly looking at it, because we actually knew that the long-term viability of somebody like SCIA would be that the environment will need to change. Our prices would need to change, and in the short term, that wasn't happening. And we really wanted to maintain all the services that we could. SCIA could exist for the next 50 years, but certainly as a skeleton of what it is if things didn't change.
Yeah.
And the best way is to get into you get economies of scale. And I say, I used to always talk about, and I think the board got sick of me listing, saying critical mass. I said, look, we need critical mass. We need internal critical mass. We need a variety of different revenue streams. But we need critical mass. And what is critical mass? And I think critical mass started to get actually larger and larger within the environment, and the segmentation. It was just silly that there's 5 or 6 or 10 people in spinal cords all competing with each other,
Yeah.
and having wasting resources rather than getting economies of scale. So clearly from the spinal cord injury side, you know, we can actually minimize our overheads. We don't need to double up on our overheads. We can actually then deliver it. We can get more capital. Neuromoves is a beautiful, brilliant business. We run it on the smell of an oily rag. All we need is some capital. And you can get capital when you got critical mass. And I think
Yeah.
those are the
Yeah.
things that really driving it. A long-winded answer, but I think it's a good question in terms of, I mean, it's not a B. It's actually some complex thinking and some layered thinking to actually get to the position that we got to.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay.
And
Dianne, so as the CEO, a lot of the heavy lifting through this process would have
yes.
fallen on your shoulders. What were your expectations of being a CEO through a merger process? Secondly, how did you fit those? How did you fit this on top of your business as usual? And thirdly, what were the biggest surprises you found as you went through this process?
So for me, it was, going back to, the board that we have, I was so pleased. I think it's it truly has been a partnership with the SCI board and myself, recognizing our roles and what we're here to do and respecting that. But also, I think that ultimate connection, as George has said, is that we wanted SCIA to be here in the long term. We've got, and it comes back to being that sort of really clear lived experience board with capability. We did a skills matrix, we did all of those things. So the people we have lived experience, but they're also skills based, so you have this nice connection.
Yeah.
And I think for me, it was really important to the board, and I'm pleased it was important for me to be on that journey as well, so that, because we all know that sometimes the decisions are taken out of, are not done in that way, that the board will liaise with a potential new organisation, and sometimes the CEO just finds out about it afterwards. But that was really important to us, that we did it together, that this was a partnership. And I think also we recognise that, in the case of Royal Rehab, that, Matt and myself had already had quite a strong relationship anyway. So it was really positive to see, the two boards working together and the two CEOs working together. And we knew that meant that would give, as and when this became public, if it was, if we were going to get to the point once we'd done all the due diligence, that our staff would be, more relieved, and our clients and our members would feel more reassured that, this was genuinely a team effort on all sides, two boards working together, two CEOs working together, and then obviously as time went on, two executive groups working together as well. So it was a challenge to manage the workload, going to your point of workload, and it was not always easy. But, again, going back to the board, there was a prioritization. The board said, this is the priority, Dianne. We need to keep things moving, obviously, but we do need to make sure, because, we're in services that no one else is too. So for us, we knew that there was an opportunity to, if we didn't continue, as in SCIA didn't continue, in some cases, there was no one to pick up if we weren't there. Yeah. So I think that it was really a balancing act around that, in terms of just managing the workload. And it did take, I think there was also quite a bit of time, as George said, put into the process, so it wasn't as quick as it looked. So although it was a significant workload, it was over a period of time that was more manageable.
The press releases, the press release I saw that came out, I think in June or July this year, that there was an exploration of merger, and then there was an announcement of merger, I think in October of this year. So how long have the preparations gone back, and how long has this conversation been active?
Before we got into putting the exploration out, we needed to be sure on both sides, didn't we, George, that this was something that could work and that we thought was good for both organisations. So to do that, there was a period of time, probably it took nearly 12 months to completion, when we got to completion in September. So that was the beginning of the year, realistically. It took a good 6 months, didn't it, George, to get to do a level of due diligence on both sides that said, yes, this looks like this would work and this is how it might look. So that when we went out to exploration, we had a bit more knowledge of each other and made it public at that point, because we thought it was important that it wasn't a done deal by any means, but that we at least knew enough about each other that we would think this was going to work.
Yeah, fantastic. So I've seen the average merger being 12 to 18 months. So it's bang on from that first conversation through to completion. And I think the communication was really well managed. Having read through the press releases, very clear, very concise, and I'm sure there was 1,001 questions that they threw up amongst your members, but certainly from a sort of outsider's perspective, I thought the communication was managed really well. Dianne, just another question to you. Did you know that there would be an executive role for you at the end of this process?
No.
When you started?
No. There was no. There was a general conversation about that, in terms of, there was certainly Matt and myself had talked about it, and he had indicated that they're probably, if you want to stay, we'd be happy to keep you, but we never got into the detail of what that might look like. The focus for us and for myself and the board was really to make sure that the organisation was okay. And that after that, we then, it was certainly, there were conversations, but nothing definite, on that. And that's being worked through now. But, I have been given a commitment, to be here if in the group, if I, and work through what that might look like.
Right. Well, kudos to you, because I think self-interest is the single greatest impediment to otherwise great mergers. So, kudos to you for embarking on this process without clarity on where you would end up. But I think it takes that bravery in order to get mergers, get momentum behind mergers. So well done. Okay, a couple of other questions. Dianne, was there anything that through this process really surprised you about either going through a merger or the relationship between Royal Rehab and SCIA?
I think one of the surprising things for us or for me in particular, is I knew that people really liked, all the interactions, as I said, that we'd had over the years and that I'd been around, and anyone that talked about the group, but I could see the excitement when we did announce this, that the staff and the clients, the members were going, actually, we could, we see this works. Like, I even had somebody just this morning actually say that to me. Oh, it looks like it just works, and it's such a unique model. It makes sense. And so for me, that was not we knew it kind of made sense, but it was a nice surprise to me that people could see that, that externally straight away, our clients, our staff, all said this could be really exciting. This combination between particularly a hospital, for us, particularly because our core and our heart is spinal cord injury and spinal cord conditions, which, and so they start, when someone has the injury, and that connects into the hospital system. So people were very excited about the fact that we can go on that journey all the way through life, and saw that. So we were concerned that we thought that this was a great thing, obviously, from our perspective, but it was really nice to hear that from the people that were, when we talked to them about it, they could see it, they could feel it, they could touch it. And as a result, they're quite excited by it.
Fantastic. George, a couple of questions for you. What was from your perspective, what was the hardest thing over the last year or so?
Look, I think if I call the hardest thing, I think firstly, probably convincing our members, because I think that was probably what we needed to do. I
Yeah.
think
Can
we
you
were,
describe the membership model, please?
yeah, we've got about what, 3,000, 4,000 members.
3,000, over 3,300 members.
Yeah,
Yep.
3,300 members. And we were a member-based organisation.
Uh-huh.
And we'd had a couple of attempts at mergers pre-me, and it actually failed because we needed to get 75% of the vote. So, in
Yeah.
some sense, it was like a constitutional referendum. We know how referendums go. And
Yeah.
we were very, in some sense, a conditioned precedent was for us to really work on our members. So, I think that was the hardest thing, just to make sure that it had failed for reasons beforehand, and maybe some of those were self-interest of both ourselves and maybe the other partners that we're trying to do. So we needed to make sure that when we did go to the members, we actually had a story and a good story to say. I think the president and I actually even did a podcast together. It was a conversational podcast, and we were asking each other's questions. Why are we doing this, etc., etc. And it ran for half an hour, and that went to our members as well and to the staff internally, because a lot of our staff are, and we needed to get 75%, and I think
Yeah.
in the end we ended up getting about 94 or
Yeah,
95%
it
of
is.
the
Yeah.
vote.
Right.
So for me, that was always the issue. I think when the board had come into the thing, I think I think it's quite funny. I think that was the only hard, because I think we had such a beautiful brand. So many people had always been interested with us. The Spinal Cord Injury Australia's brand is unbelievably good. We've punched, dare I say, above our weight in terms of our size. We're not small, but we weren't big. We were doing so many fantastic things, and dare I say, under the leadership of Dianne as well and her team, we'd actually improved that through our neuromoves business, and suddenly, we were working in a number of states. So, in some sense, we were very takeoverable. If very, in terms of a target for other people. People were always interested in us. It wasn't, we never had suitors. So I think getting people to talk to us wasn't a problem. I think we had the numbers through, we had all the other stuff that was going through, and we had some really fantastic things that we had done. So I think that was the easy part.
Yeah.
The other hardest part, I think, apart from the members, I think was just the environment. It's a really tough time, like for everyone. So it's not only the really small ones and us who, in some sense, we were classified as large, but all the other large players had all these other issues as well.
Yeah.
No one's devoid of issues, and especially going through COVID. Doing a merger or talking mergers while trying to survive COVID, or the NDIS. So I think that's the other hard thing, is getting through the noise of saying this is going to be a good thing.
Yeah.
We're going to go through that thing. I think the third thing is the M&A expertise of the whole sector. It was fortunate that I've got an accounting and legal background. In some sense, Royal Rehab has a number of people as well. That really helps. I think if you don't actually have those people, but who are embedded in the organization, you can bring people in, but it's not the same. I think you need to sometimes have that internal thing. So I think that made the process easier. But I'll go back. It was the members, and we were able to convince them.
Well done. Yeah. Agree. That could be a hurdle that's hard to get over, but well done. Okay, without wanting to be overly provocative, there's something that I see through this merger that I'm sure is a challenge you considered from the beginning and have addressed, and that is SCIA being a smaller organization, very much driven by personal experience. So talk about the peer program you've got. Royal Rehab is a bigger organization and a conglomeration of different services and structures, albeit largely relevant to spinal cord injury. How are you going to, through this process, make sure SCIA doesn't lose its nature of remaining close to the needs and the experience of people with spinal cord injury? And secondly, how are you going to maintain or honor brand and history and legacy and all the things that often stop people entering this process in the first place? Maybe George, you go first.
Yeah, look, that's a really good question. sometimes you can't control things, well into the future because you don't know the environment. But I look at it this way is that in some sense, we're going to have access to more capital, so we should be able to do it. And clearly, our belief is that the Royal Rehab Group and its DNA is actually going to push that on. Now, if down the track, again, you don't know what's going to happen in 10, 15 years' time, you may get another group who says, look, we don't really care about this. But there's a need and the gap there. And so if Raw Rehab through SCIA doesn't do it, in 10 or 15 years' time, there will be an organization that grows outside that will fill that gap. So for me, if
Yeah.
I look at the purpose of our members, is yeah, I believe at this moment in time, but you can't control things into the future, that they're the best. But if in the future they decide or there's a move away from that core, somebody else will actually do it because it's actually so important to be done, and that's why we've existed. So um, if we don't do it, if the Raw Rehab and with SCIA as part of that group doesn't do it, eventually somebody else will. So that's the confidence that I have. But you can't control things. I think you can only sort of, in a certain manner, say this is what we believe and go that way. But if you want to control things, as I call from the grave for the next 15 years, you're not going to get that. And that will always be a no. You go, oh no, I can't guarantee for the next 10 years. Well, okay, you'll never have a merger.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I think
that's it.
that's really important. But the need is real. The need is there, and it will always be sorted out. And it'll either be done by this, in one sense, this merged entity, or it will be done by somebody else.
Brilliant. Great answer, George. Thank you. Dianne, having gone through a couple of mergers, a number of mergers myself, I know there's the preliminary work, the agreeing, George, you talked about term sheet, agreeing governance structures and corporate structures and who's going to sit in which chair. Then there's the post-merger implementation work. Which have you enjoyed? Maybe enjoy is the wrong word. Which has been the hardest, and it may be too early for you to comment, I guess, but which you feel has been most challenging, the preliminary work or the post-merger implementation, the fun systems stuff around IT and awards and all that kind of stuff?
That's an interesting one. It probably is a little bit early days on the implementation because we're just, 6 weeks in. But I think, to be honest, it was probably doing the pre-work because nobody knew, you know what I mean? Like, so you're managing, a lot of things behind. I mean, the executive, there was the executive team but we were asking for lots of information. We were pulling a lot of information together that we needed to have to be as part of the due diligence. And that was sometimes a bit difficult. And then, obviously some of our managers and our staff were going, things are looking really tight. We're getting worried. And we'd be saying, we're doing okay. We've got a plan. We've got a plan. Please don't worry. The board's onto it. I'm onto it. Together we're working. SCIA will be here in the long term. But it was difficult because you couldn't, you couldn't share those things at that time because we needed to be sure that this was something that we were comfortable with and that the Royal Rehab were, comfortable with, and before you can go forward. So I think that was a bit challenging because you could see we have some, very dedicated employees and that are also members, as well. And so you could see that they were, they knew what was happening in the external environment too. They knew what was happening. They knew what was going on, and they're going, are we going to be here in the long term? And so I think that was probably quite challenging. And that is why then, when we started to make it public, I was so pleased and so, surprised that it was taken so well, if that makes sense, because, it was such a relief.
Yeah, I think we, being leaders in the for-purpose sector, worry more than we need to. And the truth is, most clients or members see the same vision that we might have entering this sort of process. Ultimately, the people will receive greater social impact assistance with their condition, whatever else it might be. So good on you. Okay, Dianne, one quick last question to you, and I'll finish with one for George. On a personal level, in an exec capacity, what's the thing that keeps you up at night now we're at the other side of the watershed?
I think for me, it's about making, it is about making sure that we settle the ship in the new world. You know what I mean? Like it sort of goes into in the way, and that there's not that we do it in a way that maintains, our services and it doesn't impact negatively on our members or our clients. One of the big things we're working on at the moment, which was exciting part of the agreement with Royal Rehab, is implementing a lived experience council.
Okay.
So, that's the next step that we've got to do. And that lived experience council is as it sounds. It's people living with disability, which will go across the whole of all the Royal Rehab Group, linking up to the CEO, the group CEO, Matt, and then the Royal Rehab Group board. So I think for me, it's now working on what that's going to look like with Royal Rehab Group. And we've got a member from our board who has lived experience, who's going to chair the Lived Experience Council. Yeah. And so for me, that's kind of the next, there's two things. One is kind of settling it into the new world and making sure we continue in the direction that we promised, our members that voted for this. And then the other is getting the Lived Experience Council up and running as quickly as we can, because that represents what we made the commitment to, in that we would keep that core lived experience connection that SCIA had on its own.
Great way to a great way to get continuity from SCIA's experience through to the new structure. Okay, George, last question to you. SCIA was founded in 1960s, if I remember right, by a couple of young blokes with spinal cord injury, and I wrote this phrase down. The organisation was set up to do whatever it takes after a spinal cord injury. What do you think those young men would say today, looking at this significant change?
Look, I think they would say, well done. I think they know that you need to have critical mass and you need resources and capital to actually do that. And to have an organisation that does focus on them. There's 20,000 people with spinal cord injury in Australia, and they deserve to have an unfragmented service. At the moment, I think one of the complaints was, there's 3 or 4 places to go, or 10 places, and they're all competing for me. To have one voice, and I think the continued consolidation will then be able for us to more efficiently, effectively give them resources that they need. I mean, really be for purpose, rather than, a lot of, in some sense, a lot of do-gooders, which is fantastic, but, have a really professional outlook and really have capital to have the best systems, to have the best way to actually access them, the best digital systems. And that can't actually be done if you're a smaller concern. You have to have critical mass. So I think they'd be looking at this with the ability to say, oh my God, where are we going with this? This can actually really take this to the next level in this organization. Because Royal Rehab has been involved in spinal cords for so long as well. It's not like we're entering another place that has no idea of what we do. I mean, in some sense, Royal Rehab were the people who are actually fixing them physically, and Spinal Cord Injury Australia was actually fixing them mentally. And I think that combination and the understanding between those two, I think, is fantastic. So I'd hope that they think it'd be a great thing, because I think it's a great thing, because I think when I've looked at it, as I said, my purpose was always to make sure that we did the best thing for the members, and I think this is on that road.
Well, if those founders say well done, I'll say well done too. I've been really impressed by this partnership and everything that you've presented here about your experience and the rationale behind it. So well done, and kudos to you both and the rest of the, I'm sure, very large team that worked with you on this journey.